At the age of 70, when many people have already chosen to step back from the spotlight, Jimmy Fortune still walks out onto the stage, stands before the audience, and lifts his familiar voice. Yeah. It is a voice that can make an entire hall fall silent. What people see is a gentle, humble man who has lived his entire life guided by faith and gospel music. But behind the applause lies the story of a replacement singer. Life and death surgeries, long nights spent fearing he might never sing again. And most painfully, the devastating loss of his son. Every legend carries a private wound, and for Jimmy Fortune, that wound began in childhood. Jimmy Fortune was born on March 11, 1955, in Staunton, Virginia, a small town nestled among rolling green hills where Sunday mornings began with the ringing of church bells. He grew up in a working-class family as the seventh of 9 children. Their old wooden house lacked material comfort, but music and faith were as natural as breathing. His father often sat on the front porch with a guitar resting on his lap, strumming scattered chords that drifted through the afternoon air. His mother sang hymns, slow and steady, filling the room as dusk settled in. Jimmy would sit quietly beside her, listening. And from those evenings his voice began to form without lessons or instruction. Behind those peaceful moments was a childhood, marked by instability. Alcohol often arrived in the house before words. There were days when his father came home unsteady, distant, like a different man altogether. Jimmy learned early to stay silent, not out of obedience, but because silence was the only way to keep the house from falling further into chaos. Years later, he spoke about it plainly, recalling times when he was too young to understand fully, yet old enough to drive his father home while he was drunk. His mother poured alcohol down the toilet in desperation, only for his father to sneak back and drink again. In that environment, Jimmy learned to escape not through rebellion or complaint, but through music. At 8 years old, he found an old guitar thrown away in a trash pile near his house. It had only 2 strings left, scratched and battered, but Jimmy played those 2 strings for years. He later admitted he didn't know what he was playing, only that it made him feel better. Then, at Christmas in 1967, his parents gave him a real guitar. He held it in his hands and whispered, almost afraid, "Is this a real guitar?" In that moment, a dream stepped out of imagination and took shape. Jimmy told his father that if he could sing and play, he would make a living through music. His father shook his head and said it wasn't possible, not unkindly, but firmly. Jimmy didn't argue. He simply understood that music was not a hobby for him. It was everything. His voice was noticed early in church services, high, clear, and sincere. He didn't sing with technical perfection, but with a feeling that soothed people as if he were singing on their behalf. After graduating from Nelson County High School, Jimmy worked at a car dealership by day and sang wherever he could at night. Small restaurants, roadside motels, VFW halls, community picnics. He set up his equipment under dim lights and sang, while people talked and ate, wondering quietly if his music truly meant anything. On long drives home, he whispered to himself that if God had given him this voice, there had to be a reason. That reason revealed itself in 1982 at a winter resort where Jimmy was singing to a room that barely listened. Watched closely, noticing how Jimmy breathed and held his notes. That man was Lou DeWitt, the tenor voice of the Statler Brothers, who was battling severe Crohn's disease. After the set, Lou walked up to Jimmy and softly said, "I think you should audition for the Statler Brothers." On January 28, 1982, Jimmy drove to Nashville and sang for the band. He didn't explain himself or his past. He just sang. Silence that followed answered everything. That same night, Jimmy stepped on stage with the Statler Brothers in Savannah, Georgia. By August 1982, he was officially a member, stepping into the shadow of a legend. Replacing Lou DeWitt was a role filled with pressure. Jimmy could not sound too much like Lou or too different either. Every night felt like a test. The pressure followed him off stage into hotel rooms and tour buses. Still, he endured. In 1983, he began writing songs late at night. And one of them, Elizabeth, quietly returned the Statler Brothers to the top of the Billboard charts. My Only Love followed, then Too Much on My Heart, each carrying pieces of Jimmy's inner life that he rarely spoke about. The band returned to sold-out tours and renewed recognition not through spectacle but through steady, heartfelt music. In 1988, More Than a Name on a Wall was released. It's becoming a song of comfort at memorial services and moments of loss. By the late 1990s, the Statler Brothers understood it was time to step away on their own terms. On October 26, 2002, they performed their final show. For Jimmy, who had joined later and stood slightly to the side for 20 years, the ending forced a quiet question. Who was he without the Statler brothers? His solo career began gently with the album When One Door Closes in 2003, followed by others that focused on faith, family, and reflection rather than success. Partnering with the Gaither Music Group brought his voice into churches and intimate gatherings where comfort mattered more than acclaim. Jimmy chose fewer shows, smaller venues, and a slower pace, carrying his past without letting it weigh him. Dana's personal life had been marked by early hardship. Married at 17, Jimmy became a husband and father before he truly knew himself. Two early marriages ended quietly, not through scandal, but through distance and immaturity shaped by life on the road. In 1998, his life changed when he married Nina, a woman who brought calm rather than momentum. With her, Jimmy learned how to stay. Together, they formed a blended family of 7 children, imperfect but steady. Then his health began to fail. Subtle symptoms led to a diagnosis of severe heart disease. On February 15, 2023, Jimmy underwent a quintuple bypass surgery. Recovery was slow and humbling, forcing him to listen to his body for the first time. Faith became less about answers and more about endurance. Just as his strength began to return, tragedy struck again. On October 15, 2024, Jimmy's son Lester James Fortune Jr. passed away suddenly at the age of 51. The loss was devastating. Jimmy did not turn it into a public story. Those close to him simply noticed his voice grow deeper and his silences longer. Today, at 70, Jimmy Fortune lives a quieter life. Still singing when his body allows, still writing, still standing on stage, not to prove anything, but because he has something honest to share. His net worth, estimated between $7 and $8 million, has given him freedom, not excess. He continues to sing alongside others in Brothers of the Heart, not competing but blending voices shaped by time. Jimmy Fortune's life has been marked by poverty, anonymity, failed marriages, serious illness, and unimaginable loss. What endures is not the tragedy, but his refusal to let it take the rest of his life. As long as there is breath, he believes there is a reason to sing. His journey continues quietly, unfinished, carried forward by a voice that has known pain, and still chooses to rise. In recent years, those who attend Jimmy Fortune's performances notice something different that cannot be measured by applause or ticket sales. His voice no longer rushes to meet the moment. It waits. There is a patience in the way he steps up to the microphone, a quiet awareness of how fragile breath can be. Each song feels chosen rather than scheduled, as if he weighs whether his heart is ready before his voice ever rises. When he sings now, it is not to reclaim anything that once was, but to acknowledge what still remains. Jimmy often speaks less between songs than he once did. When he does speak, it is not with rehearsed anecdotes or polished humor, but with small reflections that feel almost accidental. He might mention a hymn his mother used to sing, or a road he drove late at night decades ago when he was still, wondering if anyone would ever truly hear him. These moments are brief, but they settle into the room with the same weight as the music itself. Audiences listen differently now, not waiting for a hit, but for something honest. After the loss of his son, Jimmy learned that grief does not arrive loudly. It enters quietly and stays. There are mornings when the house feels unchanged, yet something inside feels permanently altered. He has spoken privately about how that loss reshaped his understanding of faith, not as something that explains suffering, but as something that helps a person keep breathing through it. He does not claim peace where there is none. He simply continues forward, carrying sorrow the way one carries memory, without demanding it make sense in those quieter years. Jimmy found comfort in routines that once seemed impossible during decades of touring. Morning walks, sitting on the porch without an instrument in his hands, listening rather than performing. Music remained central to his life, but it no longer consumed every corner of it. Where once silence felt uncomfortable, now it felt necessary. Silence became a place where healing could begin, even if it never fully finished. Friends and fellow musicians often describe Jimmy as unchanged by success. But that is only partly true. What changed was not his humility, but his relationship with expectations. Early in his career, he carried the weight of needing to belong, to prove that he deserved the place he had been given. Now that need is faded. He no longer measures himself against legends or legacies. He understands that his role was never to replace anyone, but to continue something that mattered when others could not.
When people speak of Jimmy Fortune's endurance, they often point to his long career or his survival through illness.
Cut! The endurance that defines him most clearly is quieter than that. It is the endurance of staying gentle in a world that repeatedly asked him to harden. When song could not fix what was broken, Jimmy has said that he does not think of himself as brave. Grateful for the chance to stand on stage one more time. Grateful for the years he did not expect to have after surgery, and even grateful, in a complicated way, for the pain that taught him how deeply he could feel. In small towns where he still performs, people line up afterward not to talk about charts or awards, but to share their own losses. A widow who found comfort in more than a name on a wall. A father who listened to Too Much on My Heart. On a long drive after bad news, Jimmy listens to them without trying to fix anything. He knows now that sometimes being present is the only thing music can offer, and that it is enough. Himself frozen in metal, knowing how much of his life had been spent simply trying to survive each next step. A reminder that even lives shaped by uncertainty can leave a trace behind. As time continues, Jimmy Fortune does not speak of retirement as a destination. He speaks of listening to his body, listening to his heart, listening for the moment when singing still feels like truth rather than habit. And as long as that moment continues to arrive, he will keep stepping onto the stage, not as a legend, not as a survivor, but as a man who still has something to give. What makes Jimmy Fortune's story endure is not the scale of his success, but the consistency of his spirit. Through poverty, anonymity, pressure, loss, and illness, he never abandoned the thing that first gave him refuge as a child sitting beside his mother. Listening to hymns fill a small room. There is no final triumph that erases the scars. Instead, there is continuation, a voice shaped by time. A heart repaired but forever marked. A man who learned that meaning is not found in avoiding pain, but in allowing it to exist without letting it steal the rest of your days. And so, when it carries the weight of a life fully lived, not perfectly but honestly. It carries loss without bitterness, faith without certainty, and hope without promises. As long as that voice continues to rise, even softly, his journey remains unfinished. Moving forward one song at a time, in the quiet years that followed, Jimmy Fortune became increasingly aware of how time reshapes not only the voice, but the soul behind it. Lyrics he once delivered with youthful confidence now carried layers of memory, regret, and gratitude. Some nights a single line would catch in his throat, not because he could not sing it, but because he understood it too well. He learned to pause, to let the room breathe with him, trusting that audiences who had lived their own share of life recognized that silence as part of the song. Jimmy no longer chased perfection in performance. Missed notes, no longer frightened. He stood grounded, shoulders relaxed, eyes often closed, as if singing was less about projecting outward and more about settling something within himself. Those who watched closely could see it, the difference between a man performing and a man remembering. Stitching together decades that could not otherwise touch, faith remained a constant companion, but it evolved. As a younger man, faith had been something to lean on when the future felt uncertain. Later it became something quieter, less declarative. He stopped trying to explain God through words or songs. Instead, he allowed faith to exist in routine, in endurance, in the simple act of showing up even when answers never came. Prayer became less about asking and more about sitting still, accepting that some questions were not meant to be solved within a lifetime. Jimmy often reflected on how close he came, at several points, to disappearing quietly from the path he eventually walked. If Lou DeWitt had not been listening that night in 1982, Jimmy might have continued singing in small rooms unknown beyond county lines. If his heart condition had gone unnoticed a little longer, he might never have returned to the stage at all. They filled him with humility. He understood that much of life rests not on control but on timing, and that survival itself is often an unearned gift. He also became more forgiving of his younger self. The boy who escaped into music, the teenager who married too young, man who spent years chasing opportunity while family life quietly fractured behind him. With age came compassion, not excuses but understanding, acknowledged mistakes without letting them define his worth. He learned that growth does not erase the past. It reframes it. Jimmy's relationship with his children deepened in later years, shaped by honesty rather than perfection. After losing his son, that bond with the rest of his family became even more precious. He treated each performance as an offering, something to be given carefully, respectfully. Knowing it might land in someone's life at a moment they did not yet understand themselves, he no longer worried about whether people remembered his name. If they remembered how they felt while listening, that was enough. There were days when Jimmy chose not to sing at all. When memory outweighed melody, He allowed himself those days without guilt. His humor had lost its edge, replaced by warmth. Enjoyed simple things, shared meals, familiar roads, unplanned conversations. Fame had long since stopped impressing him. What impressed him now was consistency, showing up, staying kind. Jimmy became less concerned with how his story would be told. He understood that stories change once they leave the person who lived them. What mattered was not accuracy in detail, but truth in spirit. If people remembered him as someone who sang honestly, who endured quietly, who did not let pain turn him hard, then the story had been told well enough. He never claimed to have conquered suffering. That distinction mattered deeply to him. The absence of struggle, but the refusal to let struggle define the final shape of a life. And so, Jimmy Fortune continues. Not racing forward, not clinging backward, just continuing. Man shaped by harmony, loss, faith, and time. A voice no longer seeking approval, only connection. A life that does not ask to be admired, only understood. When the lights dim and the room quiets, and Jimmy lifts his voice once more, it carries everything that came before it. The child listening to hymns, the young man wondering if his voice mattered, the replacement singer standing in borrowed space, the father who loved him perfectly, the survivor of surgery, the grieving parent. All of them stand there together, woven into one sound, and that sound, steady and human, continues to rise as the years move forward. Jimmy Fortune has grown comfortable with the idea that not every chapter needs a conclusion. Some stories simply soften at the edges and keep going. He no longer feels the urge to define what comes next. There is a freedom in that uncertainty, a freedom he never allowed himself when every decision once felt like it might be his last. Chance, now he trusts that whatever remains will reveal itself in time, just as it always has. When Jimmy looks back on his life, he does not see a straight road. He sees pauses, detours, long stretches where nothing seemed to happen, and sudden turns that changed everything overnight. He understands now that those quiet stretches were not empty at all. They were shaping him, preparing him for moments he could not yet imagine. Hey! Even the years when he felt invisible mattered. Even the nights when he sang to rooms that barely... They taught him how to sing without needing to be seen. He has spoken about how aging changes ambition. What once felt urgent now feels optional. What once felt essential now feels heavy. Jimmy no longer wants to be everywhere. He wants to be present wherever he is. That means fewer shows, then fewer shows are enough.